So the PowerPoints that we have with the Moodle site are from the previous edition of the book, but like I said, it's almost exactly the same. So you may notice like one or two diagrams might be different, or a page number might be different, but for the most part, it's the exact same thing. All right, so okay, origins of medical science. So there's a section in there. Did we talk about the learn outcomes that I want you to take notes on? Okay, so I went over that and how you're supposed to take notes. So notice that there is a learn for this that talks about some of the advances in anatomy and physiology. So that's one of your objectives. I'm not going to go through every single detail here, but one thing that I do want to talk about is how did we get a lot of our anatomy and physiology knowledge? Where did it come from? And one thing to note is that as people get sick, we try to figure out what's going on with them, right? And if someone has an injury, let's say there was a famous example you may have heard about in psychology, if you've taken psychology, but there was a guy named Phineas Gage. Have you heard of him? Has anybody heard of him? Okay, so he had a steel rod that went through his brain, and it damaged part of his brain. And from that, they realized what that part of the brain controlled, right? So sometimes it's from injuries that we get new information. The interesting thing about Phineas Gage, his personality changed. So before the injury, he was a nice person. He was very trustworthy, decent, just kind of a regular guy. And then after the injury, it's like he became a completely different person. His personality changed. He was rude. He cursed a lot. He wasn't trustworthy anymore. It was like just his whole personality changed, and that was because of the damage from that part of the brain. So that's one way that we get medical information. Another way is through dissection. Okay, so dissection of corpses. There was a really interesting book that I read called Stiff. Okay, and this was about exactly this, like the history of developing the knowledge of anatomy and physiology and for medical reasons. And it used to be illegal to dissect humans, and so they would have to steal the bodies from the graveyards, and they would pay these people to go out to the graveyard and dig up a body so that they could bring it back to their lab and dissect it. Doctors did this. They would do this on their own to try to find out, what different parts of the body control. So it's a really interesting history of how we developed our knowledge of anatomy and physiology. Of course, now today we do dissections. You have, of course, the doctors in medical school. They're going to be doing dissections, gross human anatomy, where they have the cadaver in the classroom, and they're going to be dissecting every part of it to learn the intricate details of it and how it functions. Okay, so we already talked about what anatomy and physiology means, right? So this is a review for you, form and function. The next thing that we have is levels of organization. Okay, so the levels of organization of the human body. We start with the smallest. So the smallest would be the subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are what make up atoms. Okay, this consists of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Okay, and so these subatomic particles interact with one another and make atoms. And then atoms interact, come together, bond together to make molecules. And then molecules make larger molecules. Okay, so we have tiny molecules that come together to make larger molecules. So those would be macromolecules. Then we have organelles. So organelles are the parts of the cells, and they are composed of the macromolecules, right? Then the organelles make up the cell. So these are the working parts within the cell that give the cell its function, its metabolism, those reactions that are occurring within the cell. Now, the cell, I think I mentioned this, the cell theory. Do you remember me talking about the cell theory? Okay, does anybody remember what the cell theory is? Okay, that's part of it, right? All cells come from pre-existing cells, so that's one part. What else? Cells are the basic unit of life, right? So it's the smallest unit that is still considered to be alive. And all living things are made of cells, okay? So cells are that basic unit of structure and function. And we have different types of cells within the body. There's a huge diversity of types of cells. And when we get to histology, you're going to look at those cells under the microscope and you'll be able to differentiate between a muscle cell and a nerve cell, okay? Because they have different characteristics, they have different function. That's one thing. Another thing that you'll see throughout the class is that the form and function fit together. Like you can't have the form not being conducive to the function, right? It just doesn't work. Like we talked about the heart, right? And the four-chambered heart, okay? And the chambers of the heart give the heart its function. So the structure is going to dictate the function, and the function is going to dictate the structure. So they are interconnected. They can't really be separated, because they have to fit together. All right, so that's the cellular layer. Then we have the tissues. So cells come together to make up tissues. All right, and tissues, for instance, we have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is a tissue type that all the cells have the same appearance to it. It has a lot of protein in it, and it allows for those cells to be able to contract, okay? So for instance, on the models, we have the skeletal muscle is that kind of reddish color muscle on the model, okay? That is the muscle that's going to be contracting and moving the body. So it's made up of all the same tissue. Right? An organ is a group of tissues that's working together for a specific function. Okay, so an example of an organ. Can somebody give me an example of an organ?
Liver.
Okay, the liver. What else? The kidneys. The heart. Lungs, brain, right? So a lot of all the, those major parts of the body, right? Those are the organs, and they're made up of tissues. So they're made up of more than one tissue type. For instance, the heart. The heart is made up of cardiac muscle, so that's the muscular part of the heart that allows it to be able to pump. And it's also made up of other tissues. There's some fat on the surface of the heart, that's adipose tissue. There's a layer on there that helps to protect it, a connective tissue layer. So there's different types of tissue that come together to make up that organ. Okay? And then the organs make up organ systems. So when we're talking about the organ system for, say, the heart, what would that be? Cardiovascular system, right. So the heart is part of the cardiovascular system. What about the brain? The nervous system, right. What about the stomach? Digestive, right. So all of these organs fit into a system. Now, some organs fit into more than one system, okay? Can you think of any organs that fit into more than one system? They have a dual function sometimes, okay? An example of that is the pancreas, okay? The pancreas is part of the endocrine system because it has an endocrine function of producing hormones, insulin, and glucagon. And then it also has a digestive function where it produces digestive enzymes that are released into the digestive system. So it's actually part of two systems. And there are other organs as well that are part of more than one system. Okay? So the organ system, there are 11 organ systems that we will look at throughout this class and Bio 169. And we'll go through, we're going to start with the integumentary system in this class, and we will go through integumentary, skeletal, muscular, and nervous systems. Okay, and then in 169, you'll pick up there and you'll start with the endocrine system, and you'll go endocrine. I think next is cardiovascular, lymphatic / immune system. Those two are lumped together. You have digestive, respiratory, and reproductive. Okay, and I think we hit them all there. So those are the 11 organ systems. Those 11 organ systems make up the organism. The organism, in our case, what we're talking about in this class is the human, right? But if you were taking another class where you were talking about animals or whatever, it may be the dog might be the organism that you're looking at. Or if it's plants, because plants actually have the same levels of organization, right? You might be looking at trees. They have organ systems, and the organism would be the tree. Okay, so living things have these levels of organization. And here's just a diagram that helps to depict this, where we go from the smallest with the atom, and we said atoms are made up of what? Subatomic particles, right? So atoms are made up of subatomic particles, and then we go on through the organ system. In this case, we're looking at the digestive system, and then this makes up all those organ systems making up the organism. We have some information in the book about different clinical applications, okay? And so this information is important and interesting, and I do want you to go through the clinical applications, but I'm not always going to spend a lot of time on it in class just because you see how thick these books are, and we've got to get at least halfway through the book in the semester, so I can't go through every little thing. But I still want you to read about it and study it, and there may be a question on the test that comes up about some of these things. All right, characteristics of life. So living things have certain characteristics, and humans as living organisms, we have those same characteristics. By the way, do you know what kingdom humans are in? You remember studying the kingdoms? Are we plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, protists? We're animals, right? Okay. So we're in kingdom Animalia. And members of kingdom Animalia, including us, have these certain characteristics. And one of it is movement. We are able to move around, whether we are talking about movement of the whole body, right? Or just movement of parts, okay? Or movement within the body, okay? So we have different levels or different aspects that we're talking about when we mention movement. So change in position or motion of an internal organ. What is an example of an internal organ that has movement? Your lungs, right. So your lungs are moving, expanding and contracting due to your diaphragm, right? So lungs would be moving. Digestive system, right? So within your digestive system, food is moving through the body. Blood moving through your cardiovascular system. So all of that is part of the movement. All right, the next thing is responsiveness, reaction to a change inside or outside the body. Why is responsiveness an important feature or characteristic? What if you didn't respond to anything? What would happen? You wouldn't survive, right? It's about survival. You have to be able to respond to be able to survive. Just like when you get thirsty, your response is going to be to drink something. When you get hungry, your response is going to be to eat. When you get hot, your response is going to be to sweat, right? Those are all responses, and they're important for survival and for this term that we're going to talk about, which is homeostasis. So that's coming up. That's maintaining a balance. Okay, so next thing is growth. All right, so you have growth of the whole body, but also it's an increase of body size without a change in shape. So we compare growth with development. Okay, so development, you have more of that change in shape, but growth is just getting larger, right? Reproduction. The cells need to be able to reproduce themselves, right? Your skin cells are constantly making more skin cells to reproduce. And then also reproduction of the species, right? So of the individuals so that we can carry on the species, right? So respiration. Respiration, when we breathe, right? Being able to bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So that's an important process, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the respiratory system. All right, digestion. Digestion, just what you imagine, right? So eating, and it's breaking down the food, right? But what's the point in doing that? Is it just to satisfy your hunger? Why do we have to eat food? What do you need the food for? Okay, energy, that's a big thing. For fat storage, that keeps you warm, and also for storing energy. Okay, anything else that you can think of? What about kids? Little kids have to eat to grow, right? To have those materials to be able to grow. Okay, so you have to digest to be able to keep yourself alive, to be able to have that energy for your metabolism. Okay, absorption. So after you bring it in and you break it down, then you have to absorb it. Okay, and so where the absorption happens in the stomach and in the intestines, where those foods that you ate are broken down into very simple form of molecules, and you are then going to absorb it and bring it into your cardiovascular system, into the blood. Once it's absorbed, then it's going to be circulated throughout the body. Right? So you circulate it, you send it to the cells so that the cells can make the energy or ATP with the food, and so that they can store the components of the food that you ate and use it to make new cells, use it to make cell parts or hormones or other products that the cells are in charge of. So then assimilation. So bringing in the absorbed food, right, and then making it into your own, right? You need to make it part of your cells. So it has to be assimilated. And then excretion, getting rid of the waste, removal of the waste products. Okay, so those are processes that are characteristics of life. The term metabolism down here, that's an important term, and this will definitely be on your test. Metabolism, you will definitely see that on your test. Okay, so you need to know that definition. And metabolism encompasses all of the chemical reactions that occur inside of the cell. Okay, a lot of times when we think of metabolism, we're just thinking about how fast do we burn, energy, or the foods that we're eating, how do we process it. So we kind of think about that as our metabolism, but it really includes all of the chemical reactions that occur within the body. So you got that there. Okay, so the next thing is water and food. Okay, so this is what are the requirements for the maintenance of life? And one of those things is water. Okay, why do we need water? You gotta stay hydrated, right? So what happens if you get dehydrated? Let's look at that. At a certain point, you could die from it, right? If you get too dehydrated.
Your body starts to shut down.
Right, so you start shutting down. It takes, your blood has a lot of water in it, right? The watery part of the blood is called the plasma. Okay, and so you have to have water in your blood. When you drink water, it goes into your stomach and then you absorb it. So one of those processes is absorbing. And then it goes into the blood vessels, into the blood, and then you circulate it. Okay, and so that water is needed for the cells. And it goes all over the body. It's needed to carry nutrients and waste throughout the body. So water is really important. It's the most abundant substance in the body. It provides an environment for metabolic processes. It's required for transport, like nutrients and other substances that are traveling through the blood, hormones, things like that. And regulation of body temperature. How does water help you to regulate body temperature? Cooling you down if you're hot. How do you cool down when you're hot? Let's say you're outside exercising. It's 100 degrees out there. What are you going to start doing? Sweating, right? So that's you lose a lot of water through that sweating process, through that temperature control. And we'll talk more about that and the feedback mechanisms for controlling body temperature. Okay, we talked about digestion, and another thing that is required for maintaining life is food and digestion. Okay, so you have to have necessary nutrients, it supplies energy, raw materials for building blocks. So once you bring that food in, you need to assimilate it into your own body cells. And we'll talk about some of the processes that our cells use to produce products that are needed to make new cells, products that are needed to, like hormones, to regulate hormones throughout the body, for nerve impulses, things like that. So as we go through the different systems, you'll see how each one of these things is important. Okay, oxygen. Oxygen is important. We use oxygen to make ATP. Okay, so we use food, our carbohydrates, and we use oxygen to make ATP. And we're going to talk about a process called cellular respiration. Has anybody ever heard of cellular respiration? Okay. It's a kind of a complicated process, right? And does anybody know what organelle cellular respiration occurs in? Starts with an M. Mitochondria, right? So cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria, and that's why we need oxygen. Okay, that's why we sit here and we're breathing, is to get that oxygen in so that we can then use it to make energy. Okay, that's why we have to breathe out, because during the process of making ATP, carbon dioxide is released as a byproduct, and we have to get rid of that. Okay, so we have this constant breathing. That's why you're sitting here breathing. That's why when you're wearing a mask, like when I wear a mask and I'm trying to talk like this, teaching, I start having a hard time breathing, right? And it can make you feel lightheaded, right? Because your body will start shutting down if you have a lack of oxygen. And your nerve cells are one of the first ones to be affected by that. So that's why we need oxygen, is to make energy, and then the energy is used for all the processes that are occurring within the body. All right, heat. So we either get heat from our surroundings, right? Or we need to make our own heat, just kind of like a baseline heat to keep our body temperature at a certain point. Okay, we have to have our body temperature at a certain point so that our chemical reactions can continue to occur. If we get too cold, everything starts slowing down and shutting down. So we need to have this certain amount of heat for the chemical reactions to be able to continue. So we have our energy from the environment, and we also get it from cellular respiration, produces a little bit of heat that we're able to use, and it helps to control that metabolism. Okay, pressure. All right, so we have to have a certain amount of pressure to be able to survive. You wouldn't really think about this unless you went to somewhere where you didn't have pressure, right? And if you don't have the air forcing into your lungs, it's really hard to breathe, okay? So pressure is the force on an object. We have our atmospheric pressure, important for breathing. When you open your mouth, so you're just sitting here, your mouth closed, open your mouth and just relax. Air forces into your mouth, okay? And that's because of that atmospheric pressure. What would happen if you went way up high on a mountain, or you were really high, like almost to space or in space? Do you have that same pressure? No. There's less atmospheric pressure. But we're down here at sea level, right? And so we have plenty of pressure forcing into our lungs. It makes it easier to breathe, right? And then also hydrostatic pressure. Hydro, what does that refer to? water, right? So we have hydrostatic pressure keeps the blood flowing. That pressure of the fluid within the blood vessels, and it allows it to continue to move within the body. I mentioned the term homeostasis, right? I said metabolism and acquiring different foods and water and all of that, it leads to homeostasis, right? So that's maintenance of a stable internal environment. Okay, that's a really important term. Will definitely be on your test. You'll have it throughout the semester. We will come back to homeostasis and homeostatic mechanisms and these different three parts of the homeostatic mechanism. So this is really important. The homeostatic mechanisms are how your body maintains homeostasis. So it's systems for that. And each one has three parts. You have a receptor, a control center, and an effector. Okay? The receptor is what's going to detect the change. So there will be a change within the body. Let's say your blood pressure, for instance. Let's say your blood pressure starts to go up, right? Your body's response would need to be to bring it back down to normal. Okay? So a receptor is going to detect that the blood pressure is increasing. All right? And it provides that information to other parts of the body to help to maintain a balance. So then you have the control center. The control center is going to maintain a set point. So you have kind of a normal blood pressure, and then if it gets too high, right, it goes above the set point, you want to bring it back down. If it gets too low, below the set point, you want to bring it back up. So it can go up or down, and then there's this middle range where you want to try to keep it. It's not always exact at one particular point. It has a range where it will fluctuate, sometimes fluctuate throughout the day, right? So your blood pressure while you're sleeping might be different than when you're walking, different than when you're sitting here in class, but you need to keep it within a certain range so that you will maintain safety and homeostasis. Okay? Then you have the effector. The effector is what's going to respond and what can make the change. Okay? So one thing that can change your blood pressure is your heart beating, right? If your heart is pumping really hard, right, it increases your blood pressure. Or your heart relaxing a little bit, that can decrease the blood pressure. Also your blood vessels, the dilation and contraction of the blood vessels changes your blood pressure. So those would be the effectors, the muscles or glands that are going to be responding and changing to make that system go back to that set point, maintaining homeostasis. Here's a diagram that helps to show that. So we started out over here with the receptors, and they're detecting a change. So the stimulus is the change that occurs, right? Another example, a common one that we use, is temperature, your body temperature, right? Let's say you get too cold, okay? So the stimulus is the cold air. Okay, cooling your body down. The receptors are going to detect that change. You have receptors in your hypothalamus, which is inside of your brain. And what would inside of the brain have to do with being cold? What is it that's going to be picking that up? Something else gets cold. Your skin gets cold, and then from the skin inside to the blood. Okay, the blood starts cooling down a little bit, and it's flowing through the body, and you have these receptors in there that are going to detect that. So the hypothalamus would be where the receptors are. There's also a control center which has the set point. The hypothalamus is where the control center is as well, right? So that set point, oh, I'm getting too cold, I need to respond to that, right? So it goes below the set point, and then the effectors are going to have a response. So one of the first things that happens is you get like goosebumps, right? Your skin starts to contract, and that contraction helps to produce a little bit of heat and helps to warm you up, okay? Also, it may be a behavioral thing. When you get cold, you start shivering, right? And it lets you know, I need to put a jacket on or something like that to help keep my body stable, okay? So the effectors are the muscles or glands, and then you have that response. It brings it back to the set point, and then the receptors are going to detect that. Oh, I'm back at set point, and everything's okay, and I can relax. Okay, this example goes through what we call the negative feedback mechanism. Negative feedback mechanisms are what help to control the body and keep it balanced and keep it at set point or within that range. Okay, so I want you to remember that most of the mechanisms that we're going to talk about are negative feedback. We also have positive feedback, and we're only going to talk about 2 examples of positive feedback because they're very specific. But negative feedback brings the body back to normal, back to set point. Okay, so it's maintaining homeostasis by bringing the body back to set point. Positive feedback mechanisms take the body away from set point. Okay, so it takes it further away. An example of that with positive feedback, why would you need to go away from set point? One example is childbirth. Okay, so delivering the baby takes the body away from the set point during the labor contractions. Okay, so it starts out and it's just a little contraction, just a little bump, and then it gets worse, and then it gets worse, and they get closer together, right? So instead of getting back to normal, it's amplifying the response and making it worse and worse and worse, taking the body away from normal set point until the baby's delivered, and then you can go back and maintain homeostasis. Okay, so that's positive feedback. Blood clotting is another example of positive feedback. Okay, so with blood clotting, the clotting factors start to build up and fibers start to build up, and the clot gets worse and worse and worse and worse, right? So it's taking away from set point because the set point is the flow of blood, right? So the blood flowing through the blood vessels. But if you have a clot that's building up, it's amplifying the response and making it worse as time goes on. Okay, so that's positive feedback. All the other examples are negative feedback. So temperature control. When it gets too hot, you're going to cool down by sweating. When it gets too cold, you're going to shiver. You're going to start to produce that shivering body heat to help to bring you back up. Okay, that's negative feedback. If your hormone levels are fluctuating, right, you're going to produce more hormones to keep your body within that normal set point. That's negative feedback. It's bringing you back to normal. Okay, if you're starting to dehydrate, it's going to stimulate you to want to drink more and also to retain more water within the blood. Okay, so that's negative feedback. Think of anything else. Your blood calcium levels. Okay, so your blood calcium levels fluctuate a little bit, but they have to stay within a certain range. If it gets too low, then you're going to release calcium from your bones to go into your blood so that you can maintain calcium within the blood for your muscle contractions and for nerve impulses. Okay? If the calcium level gets too high in the blood, then you're going to deposit calcium into the bones to keep your bones strong and to have it stored for later on. Right? So that's negative feedback. So those are all examples of negative feedback mechanisms that your body's using to maintain, what's that term? Homeostasis, right? So you're maintaining homeostasis through negative feedback. So this example here is what we talked about with the body temperature going up or going down, and comparing that to like a thermostat, right? So the thermostat in your home, it has a little temperature on there, digital, or a little temperature gauge on it. A thermometer, that's what I was trying to think of. It has a thermometer on the thermostat, and when the temperature changes, it's either going to turn the AC on, or it's going to turn it off, or if it gets cold, then it's going to turn your heat on. So your body has basically the same thing. It has that thermostat. You've got your set point, whatever you're comfortable with, right, in your home. Or for humans, we're 37 degrees Celsius is our normal set point. Okay, so here we've got an example here with the microphone sends stronger electrical signal to amplifier. So that's just an electronic example. But here we have, I'm sorry, this is positive feedback. So this is the labor contractions that I talked about here. Okay, so you have the baby's getting ready to be born. It starts out with contractions, and the contractions are small, and then as that's detected, it gets worse. This stretch within the uterus and the cervix, and then it gets worse and worse, and it keeps going until finally the baby's born. All right, so it's taken away from bringing it back to normal. So why is it called negative feedback? Because you think about, a lot of times students get confused and they think that negative feedback is only going to be like if you're talking about temperature, right? Bringing the body temperature back down, but it's also bringing the body temperature back up, or with the blood pressure, bringing the blood pressure down, but it's also bringing the blood pressure back up. All of that is negative feedback, okay? It's negative because the response to the change moves the variable in the opposite direction of the deviation from the set point. So it's just bringing it back to the set point. Okay, positive feedback, as we said, is uncommon. It's short-lived. It produces unstable conditions. The examples that I mentioned, blood clotting and the contractions of childbirth, those are your two examples. So you got to remember positive feedback, those two examples. Everything else is negative feedback. Okay? Okay, so the body is organized, and there's different portions, two main portions of the body. The axial portion and the appendicular portion. Okay, axial portion, we're talking about the middle part, so the head and the trunk of the body. The appendages are the arms and the legs, okay, and the hands and the feet. Those are the appendages. So we have axial and appendicular. Okay, we also have cavities within the body. Okay, so the body cavity is going to be a space inside of the body where you find organs. Okay, so you have a space here in your skull, the cranial cavity. What organ are you going to have in the cranial cavity?
Brain.
The brain, right. In the thoracic cavity, in the chest, you have organs in there. What do you have in the thoracic cavity? The heart and the lungs. Okay. The abdominopelvic cavity. So you have abdominal and pelvic, but it's really one cavity together. There's not a definition there between the two. So we call it the abdominopelvic cavity. What do you find in here? Your digestive organs, right? You've got your intestines, your stomach, all of those, and then your reproductive organs as well in the pelvic. So these cavities are spaces in there. I'm going to go back here and introduce this term here, viscera. Okay, the viscera. When you hear that term viscera, think the organs. Okay, because we're going to talk about visceral membranes and parietal membranes. And the visceral membranes, the viscera, that's those internal organs. Okay, the body cavities. You have the diaphragm that separates the body cavities of the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic. Okay, and today we're going to look at the torsos, and we're going to see where the diaphragm is. We're going to look at where these cavities are. And those different connections between the cavities. You also have the mediastinum or the mediastinum. Okay, this is the region between the lungs. This is where you have the heart, the esophagus, the trachea, and the thymus. Okay, thymus and thyroid are different. Okay, a lot of times people get confused. And when you look at the torsos today, I want you to see if you can find the thymus. Okay? So make sure you look for that. All right, so I mentioned abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. All right, so cranial in here. The vertebral canal, right? So that's a space within the spinal column, the vertebrae. The thoracic cavity in here. There's that diaphragm, which is a skeletal muscle. It's a muscle that divides those two cavities. The abdominal cavity here, and then the pelvic cavity at the bottom, which together makes up that abdominopelvic. Okay, and you do need to know these cavities and these different parts of the cavities. Right here you can see from the anterior view, so that would be the front or the ventral view. Ventral and anterior for humans is the same thing. So from this view, you have You can see where that mediastinum is, right in the middle. The heart would be right here, the trachea and the esophagus right here. There you've got the lungs, so it's divided up there. You have the pleural cavities. Pleural is referring to the lungs, and pericardial is referring to the heart. When you get down here, you can see the diaphragm going all the way across there. There are also cavities, smaller cavities within the skull. Okay, so in the bone, there's these smaller spaces that produce the sinus cavities, right? So you've got these frontal sinuses up here. You don't usually notice that until you have like a sinus infection or something, right? And then you feel this pressure right here, right? Or down here under your eyes, right? So these cavities are within the bone. You have the frontal sinuses. You have the orbital cavities, orbits where your eyes are. Okay, so the eye sockets are the orbital cavities. You have the sphenoidal sinuses. So that's back, like behind your nose. And you feel like a deeper pressure back there from a sinus infection back in the back. That's a lot of times the sphenoidal sinus. Your nasal cavity in there, which is the inside of your nose. Okay. Then you have in your ear, you have a cavity, a space in there. And then, of course, your oral cavity, okay, in your mouth. So those are all smaller spaces that you have within the head. All right, so we're going to talk about the different layers, okay? So that we have these membrane layers that are protecting the internal organs, okay? So we have a visceral layer that I just mentioned. In visceral, you want to think of what term? The organs, right? So the visceral layer is directly on the surface of the organs. The parietal layer is the outer layer, okay? And these are membranes. So membranes are protective structures that help to separate the organ from the rest of the body, helps to protect it, hold it all in, and just kind of like packages it, okay? So these membranes are serous membranes, okay? And they consist of the two layers, the visceral layer, which is on the surface of the organ, and the parietal layer, which is the outer layer. It also lines the wall of the cavity with, like, for instance, the heart. Okay, so the heart is sitting here, and it's in the pericardial cavity. Okay, on the surface of the heart, we have the visceral layer, and lining the walls of the pericardial cavity, we have the parietal layer. Okay, and we call that pericardium. Visceral pericardium and parietal pericardium. Okay, and let's see, I usually have, here. So this represents my membrane here. Okay, so think about a membrane is kind of like this. It's a thin, like, sac that a lot of times is transparent like that. It's made up of different types of cells. It's slippery because it's producing fluid within there, and that's another reason why we have to have water, is to produce that serous fluid. And so this is our membrane here, okay? My fist is going to represent the heart, okay? And so my fist is inside there, so here's the top of the bag right here. It's closed off, right? And then my fist is pushed in there, and it's covered by the membrane. The part of this bag that is touching my fist would represent the visceral pericardium. The outer part here represents the parietal pericardium. And all of this would be within that pericardial cavity. Okay, so it's one membrane, right? So all of this is connected, one membrane. It folds in and goes around my fist right there. And then on the outside here, it's covering the cavity. So see this little area in there? That's the heart would fit like right in there. And the part that's touching the heart right inside would be the visceral pericardium. And then the outer part out here, it's still all part of one membrane, would be the parietal layer. Okay, and we're going to reuse those terms, visceral and parietal. So we were just talking about the pericardium, which is around the heart. We also have the pleura. The pleura, same thing, but we're talking about the lungs, right? It has visceral and parietal, but it's pleura. So just think this is your lungs, right? And so the lungs are in the thoracic cavity there, in the pleural cavity of the thoracic cavity. And on the surface of the lungs is the what? Pleura? What's the word? On the surface of the organ. Starts with a V. Visceral. Okay. And then on the outside in the thoracic cavity would be the other one, starts with a P, parietal. So you have visceral, touching the surface of the organ, parietal, which is lining the cavity. Okay? So visceral and parietal pleura for the lungs, and visceral and parietal peritoneum for the abdominopelvic cavity. So that's all those digestive organs and reproductive organs within there. They have that peritoneum. Same thing, let's say this is the liver. Okay, my hand's the liver. It's in there, it's in the abdominopelvic cavity. It has a membrane right on the surface, which is the visceral layer, and then the outer membrane that's covering that cavity would be the parietal layer. Okay? Okay, and here you can see different sections and different views where this cross section here. It's a plain section where you're looking at part of the lungs and the heart, and you can see the cavities around the lungs. That would be the pleural cavity. You can see it all the way around there, this little tiny space. And then around the heart would be the pericardial cavity. And then you've got those layers of membranes in there, right on the surface of the organ, and then the outer membrane, which is covering that cavity. Right here in the abdominopelvic cavity, you've got all these organs like going through up and down, like the intestines are twisted around, up and down, and around inside there, and they have this membrane around them. And then it's also got some fat in there that helps to cushion and protect those internal organs. All right, so visceral and parietal. Okay, so I want to stop there.